I want to finish up the last 4 pages or so of this chapter, basically Dewey's conclusion to this chapter. It's a little bit longer than I usually do, but I think it's maybe best to just keep it as one, do it in one video. So, Dewey's conclusion to this chapter on the needed reform of logic. So he's been talking a lot about how Greek logic fit into Greek life and how that is a problem for us because if you take over the logic without the kind of culture that goes along with it, problems arise. And so Dewey is concluding here, and he says, "It would be completely erroneous to regard the foregoing as a criticism of the Aristotelian logic in its original formulation in connection with Greek culture." Right? The problem is not Aristotelian logic per se, at least in its original context. As a historic document, it deserves the admiration it has received. As a comprehensive, penetrating, and thoroughgoing intellectual transcript of discourse in isolation from the operations in which discourse takes effect, it is above need for praise. Well, yeah, it sounds a little bit difficult, but so as basically a formulation of the kind of like the rules of discourse separated from operations, the operations that are related to that discourse, it's fine. Above need for praise. What has been said is a criticism of the effort to maintain that logic, with revisions here and additions there, as adequate or even relevant to the science of today. So, of course, as we've seen many times before, the problem is when you take this logic developed in one context and import it into a new context, with the understanding that logic is kind of this, eternal thing out there that is basically good everywhere. I mean, that's kind of our ideal of logic as this abstract thing which is applicable anywhere, but that's not necessarily the case, as we've seen in tying logic to biology and to culture in earlier chapters. As has already been said, the more final and complete it was for the class culture of the epoch in which it was formulated, the less adapted is it to present conditions and demands of knowledge, right? So the more something, this is a kind of an evolutionary argument, or an argument you see in evolutionary theory, that the more adapted something is to one particular environment, the less suited it is to other environments. And Dewey's kind of applying that Darwinian sort of argument to logic. I don't know if that's exactly what he had in mind, but that's how it sounds to me. The attempt to retain Aristotelian logical forms after their existential foundations have been repudiated is the main source of existing confusion in logical theory. It is the ultimate reason why logical forms are treated as merely formal, right? Because the kind of ontology to which they refer, out of which they grow, no longer exists. We've covered all that, I think, several times before, so I won't dwell on some of these points because we've talked about this a lot already. But as was earlier indicated, admiration for the comprehensive way in which classic logic accomplished its task, even from the standpoint of its contemporary cultural context, has to be qualified by recognition of the class structure of that culture. And here you're going to see a little bit of Dewey's, maybe kind of Marxism or socialism, maybe is the better word, socialism, come out. Sort of his class consciousness, class awareness. And after all, Dewey was a left-leaning intellectual. In consequence, the formulation was partial, even from the standpoint of the resources then and there available. The authors of the classic logic did not recognize that tools constitute a kind of language which is in more compelling connection with things of nature than are words. I'm even going to pause the sentence there. It's a long sentence. But the authors of the classic logic of Aristotelian style logic They were not aware that tools, of the importance of tools, that actually manipulating the environment with tools was its own kind of thing, own kind of language, maybe with with its own rules, which is actually more compelling than words in connection with those things, because tools are actually, when we use a tool, we're actually manipulating the world. Words do not have that kind of direct physical connection to the world. So they did not recognize this, nor did they recognize that the syntax of operations provides a model for the scheme of ordered knowledge more exacting than that of spoken and written language. So the syntax of how we engage through our tools with the world is more exacting, or the model that it provides is more exacting than what language as a verbal medium can provide. Because again, we can say lots of things about the world that some of them may turn out to be true, some of them may not turn out to be true, and this is always a tricky thing to figure out, if someone is actually saying something true or not. But when you manipulate the world with a tool, either it works out or it doesn't. It's more exacting, right? You get immediate feedback as to what works and what doesn't work. And so that, he's saying, is a better model, or would have been a better model for logic. Genuine scientific knowledge revived when inquiry adopted as part of its own procedure and for its own purpose the previously disregarded instrumentalities and procedures of productive workers. Again, you get a little bit of that socialistic aspect coming out there, as we need to pay attention to what workers are doing. And of course, the Greeks kind of ignored this by privileging a more pure kind of knowledge seeking that was associated with the higher classes, not with the worker classes. This adoption is the radical characteristic of the experimental method of science, is with privileging these material operations, tool use, we might say. We talk about scientific tools, scientific instruments, right? The great role of mathematics in the conduct of science shows that discourse still has a fundamental role, right? Mathematics is a kind of, we might say, a kind of language, a kind of symbol system, distinct from physical operations like speech, and that does have a fundamental role to play in science. But, he says, as far as existential knowledge is concerned, that role is now subordinate and not supreme. So he's arguing that mathematics is not supreme, and I think some mathematicians would dispute that. But, this is Dewey's view, so he gets the word here. But yeah, mathematics is not superior to actual physical operations, but subordinate to things like the experimental method and actually doing experiments. The confusion which marks logical theory is, then, a natural consequence of attempts to retain the forms of classical logical theory after the method of inquiry by which knowledge is obtained and beliefs are tested has undergone a radical change. He's made that point, numerous times now. Examples of the confusion will be given from time to time in subsequent chapters. It is fitting to give one instance here as an illustration. It concerns a matter no less important logically than the nature of the universal. So the nature of the universal. And this, of course, has been a major topic in philosophy. What is the relation between the universal and the particular? So Dewey says, the meaning ascribed to universal and particular propositions in the classical logic is unambiguous and consistent. Universal propositions are about subjects, substances, which in and by nature are self-contained existential wholes. So self-contained existential wholes are universal. Particular propositions being about the things that are by nature partial, incomplete, because exposed to change. So again, the universal is about these self-contained wholes. The particular is about what is partial, things that change. We've talked about the different valuation of change in the ancient view of the world and the modern view of the world. Species, he says, species were the substantial wholes whose activity is self-actuated and self-regulated. Incomplete things were dependent upon other things. The whole was the species fixed in nature and is the precursor of the nondescript logical class of present logical theory. So, in modern logic, we talk about classes of things, and Dewey is saying this is a kind of descendant of the Greek notion of species, the self-contained, self-actuated, self-regulated entities that were universal, that we could make universal propositions about them. Things that are partial, because incomplete in nature, can only be spoken of kathekaston, or in their severality, for they are themselves severed. It's an interesting sentence. We've got a Greek word here. Not sure how accurately I pronounce that, but it refers to the particularity. So things that are partial, that are incomplete, can only be spoken of using particular propositions, right? For they are themselves severed. They are cut off from something, from a whole. They're not whole themselves, right? There's a breakage that kind of cuts them off. They're dependent, as Dewey has said, dependent upon other things. According to the present logic, as far as it takes account of scientific methods and their conclusions, universal and necessary propositions in their logical content are non-existential, while all existential propositions are singular or several. So, universal propositions are logically non-existential, not about kind of material, existential, day-to-day things, while existential propositions or particular propositions are singular or several about various particular things, existential things. I am not objecting to the latter conception. And I think he's a little bit confused when he says the latter conception, if he's just talking about existential propositions or if he's talking about the whole of kind of this more recent conception of present logic. I think he means the whole sentence, but I'm not quite sure, because he will talk about, I believe he uses the word universal later on and makes a distinction between universal and general, which are non-existential in a sense. So I think he's kind of agreeing with this whole sentence. It is the only view possible from the standpoint of present science. I am concerned with the confusion that results when an attempt is made to combine or reconcile this view with the one inherited from the classic logic. A simple example is found in the customary illustration that is given of the Aristotelian syllogism. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So this is interesting. I mean, if you're listening to this video, you have probably heard that syllogism before. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And Dewey is saying here that this is kind of a symptom of the confusion of bringing classic logic into the present. And it's related to this idea of universal and particular. So Dewey goes on to explain, I do not believe a single instance can be found in genuine Aristotelian writings in which a singular, which by its nature is an instance of severalty, appears as the minor premise in a rationally demonstrative syllogism. Its presence in such a syllogism would contradict the whole conception of demonstration as an actualized exhibition of a necessary relation of fixed wholes to one another. So what's the problem here? The problem is that you're mixing universals and particulars. You've got universal, men and mortal. You've got this idea of the class of men, and men is defined as being mortal, related to the other class of mortality. But then you get a particular, right? You get a person, an instance. Socrates is a man. So they're saying Socrates belongs to this larger class, this species of men. Therefore, Socrates has this other kind of universal characteristic. And you don't find that, or Dewey is saying that you don't find that. I haven't tried to investigate this for myself, that you wouldn't find this mixing of universals and particulars. When I mentioned syllogisms before, this was probably a few videos ago now, and if you look this up in a more technical source about the Aristotelian syllogisms, you'll find universals. So I think the example I gave before was something like, all humans are mortal. So going with this same example, all humans are mortal, all Greeks are human, therefore all Greeks are mortal. So you're dealing with classes of things rather than specific things. Right, so this is a universal syllogism, a rationally demonstrative syllogism, dealing not with a particular individual, but with classes of things, Greeks rather than Socrates. It'll be interesting to know when this particular, the kind of origin of this, or provenance of this particular syllogism, which is famous. I mean, I heard it, throughout my life, I think. So I'd be curious about where that comes from and how connected it actually is to Aristotle or other writings of that time. Anyway, Dewey is giving this as an example of the confusion that occurs or has occurred as we have tried to kind of revise and reconcile Aristotelian logic with innovations of a more modern vintage. So, going on anyway, I spent too much time probably talking about that. Let's continue. The Aristotelian logic, as far as its spirit, instead of its letter, is concerned, is nevertheless both generically and specifically significant for what needs to be done in logic in the contemporary situation. So Dewey is saying, listen to the spirit of Aristotelian logic, not its letter, not its what the specific details of its logic. Generically, the need is for logic to do for present science and culture what Aristotle did for the science and culture of his time. So what we need to do in our time is what Aristotle did in his time. Specifically, his logic is significant for present logic in that it included in a single unified scheme the contents of both the common sense and the science of his day. So Aristotelian logic brings together common sense and science, and we still need to do that now. We can't ignore either one of them. And Dewey writes, the unification was effected in a way which is no longer possible. But we can't do that reconciling. We can't bring those two things together in the same way that Aristotle did. We can no longer take the contents and procedures of both common sense and science as inherently fixed, differing only in qualitative grade and rank in a qualitatively fixed hierarchy. So common sense changes, science changes. They're not fixed targets. They're moving, right? They're changing. They're both changing. They're not, we don't conceive of them, or at least we should not conceive of them as settled things once and for all with a particular hierarchy. And Dewey says, the fixity of the contents and logical forms of both common sense and science in the Aristotelian scheme precluded the possibility of the reaction of science back into common sense, and the possibility of the ever-continuing rise of new scientific problems and conceptions out of the material of common sense activities and materials. So although Aristotle tried to bring together common sense and logic, it does not have the possibility, he did not build in the possibility that science would react back into and change common sense, or that science would take its problems from common sense and common sense materials and activities. All that science could do was to accept what was given. All that science could do was to accept what was given and established in common sense and formulate it in its relation to the fixed subjects of higher rational knowledge. So you take what was in common sense and you relate it to the more rational concepts of kind of scientific philosophy. The present need, Dewey says, the present need is for a unified logic that takes account of a two-way movement between common sense and science. And that is a very, I think, important sentence just to take note of. This is kind of behind Dewey's project here, behind what he's trying to accomplish. A unified logic that takes account of the two-way movement between common sense and science. That science develops out of common sense, and science reacts back into or feeds back into common sense. And we've discussed that before. I won't dwell on it, but yeah, that's I think a nice summing up of Dewey's motivation. So the common sense culture which was formulated was of a high order. He's talking about Greece here. Ancient Greece. As far as free citizens, those who freely shared in the culture, were concerned, it was dominated by aesthetic and artistic categories of harmony, measure, proportion, objective design, and wholeness. So he doesn't have any snide comments to make about Greek culture. For what it was, if you were a free citizen, it was a fine culture. In addition, the leading conceptions of philosophic science were but translations into philosophic vocabulary of conceptions that dominate common sense in every period. It was kind of a common sense philosophy based on what seemed correct from common sense experience. So, for example, number 1, the category of substance is the reflection of the conception that things exist in stable form in the world, an idea not only familiar to but basic in all those common sense beliefs that have not been modified by the impact of modern science. So it seems common sense that there are these stable objects in the world. Now, from modern science, we know that's not exactly the case. But in a kind of everyday person in the street, man on the ground situation, it seems that things around us are stable objects. These things are designated by the common nouns in general use. Yeah, so nouns. Number 2, the category of fixed species corresponds to a common sense belief in natural kinds, some of which are inclusive of others, while some are exclusive. For common sense, these natural kinds do not permit of transition from one to another, nor of any overlapping. The evidence for the existence of fixed natural kinds and of substantial objects is overwhelming from the standpoint of ordinary common sense. Right? There seem to be natural kinds of things, like maybe trees might seem to be a natural kind, one thing, and they're not to be confused with other things, maybe with animals, or let's say animals, and mammals. Hairy animals seem to be a distinct natural kind from feathered animals, or animals without hair or feather, right? These seem to be distinct kinds of things that don't transition from one to the other. And now, of course, through thinking evolutionarily, we can see that the situation is more complicated. There are transitions between these different kinds of creatures, even between animals and trees, at some point in time. All right. Number 3, going on to number 3, common sense ideas, beliefs, and judgments in every culture are controlled by teleological conceptions, by ends, and in modern language, by considerations of value. And of course, in science, ends are to be considered with a great deal of care. You don't want to prematurely put an end into some process. Like, again, evolution is a good example. Maybe evolution has an end, a goal, a telos, but we don't want to assume that. You can't assume ends. Whereas in common sense, we get by assuming ends a lot of the time. That things have a purpose, that people have goals and intentions, and so on. And number 4, common sense thinks of the world of things and social relations in terms which, when they are reflectively organized, become the doctrine of graded ranks or hierarchies. So we think of things in terms of hierarchies, distinctions of low and high, inferior and superior, base and noble, and all manner of similar qualitative opposites of value are almost the stuff of common sense beliefs which have not been transformed by the impact of science. They seem to be guaranteed by the obviously perceived structure of both nature and human society. So in a kind of pre-scientific common sense worldview, it seems that some people are better than others, some kinds of people are better than others, maybe that humans are better than other kinds of animals, maybe that animals are better than plants, and so on. You get these hierarchies built in, where we're always thinking, well, this is better than that, which is based more on our cultural background and learning and things like that. And again, it's one of those things that in science you can't assume that there's a hierarchy there. Maybe it will make sense to think about it in terms of a hierarchy, but it's not good scientific practice to just assume that, because you'll end up overlooking all kinds of things and making premature value judgments and creating all kinds of problems. All right, so we are on the home stretch here, just about. So when I say, going on with what Dewey says, when I say that the philosophic science, of which logical theory was an integral member, organized these and like beliefs and ideas of common sense, it is not meant that the former merely mirrored the latter. So it's not that logical theory was simply a mirror of common sense. The very idea of reflective organization negates such a notion. Not only were the implications of which common sense was unaware made explicit, but the framework of conceptions was vastly extended by investigations of subjects with which common sense held no commerce. So logical theory in ancient Greece went beyond common sense in terms of making things explicit, which were just kind of assumed or implicit in common sense, and by looking at other subjects that common sense would not have considered. Above all, the very fact of organization involved an ordered arrangement foreign to common sense. So you were organizing things in a non-common sense sort of way when you were looking at them logically. Common sense, for example, would hardly have entertained the idea that the philosopher-scientist was higher in rank as to his objects and activities than the general and the statesman, or that the happiness of the former was of a godlike character in comparison with the happiness open to others. But nonetheless, there were things involved in Athenian culture which, when they were put in ordered arrangement with one another, took the form of this conclusion. So yeah, I think kind of common sense would not say that the philosopher-scientist is capable of the highest form of happiness compared to other people, like politicians or others. I mean, what would be the basis for that? And yet, when you start organizing, when philosophers in ancient Greek started organizing things logically, that was one of the conclusions they came to. So again, it did not simply reflect common sense. We are brought back to the conclusions of the last chapter. So it was kind of a summary here. The subject matter and methods of modern science have no such direct affinity with those of common sense as existed when classic science and logic were formulated. Science is very uncommonsensical nowadays. Just utter the word quantum here and move on. Science is no longer an organization of meanings and modes of action that have their presence in the meanings and syntactical structures of ordinary language. Yet, scientific conclusions and techniques have enormously altered the common sense relation of man to nature and to fellow man. So, again, another thing we've mentioned probably several times before, that science has definitely altered life. It can no longer be believed that they do not profoundly react to modify common sense, any more than it can now be supposed that they are but an intellectual organization of the latter. So scientific conclusions and techniques have changed our lives, altered the common sense relation of man to nature and to each other, and of people to each other. It cannot be denied anymore, right? Science changes our life changes, our common sense has to change. Science has, however, last paragraph, science has, however, affected the actual conditions under which men live, use, enjoy, and suffer much more than, aside from material technologies, it has affected their habits of belief and inquiry. So while it has changed our common sense somewhat by changing the world in which we lived, the effects on our world have been much greater. It's hard to change, much harder to change people's habits of belief. Harder to change what people believe, even if you drastically alter their lives, as our lives have been drastically altered over the last, say, 200 years. Especially is this true about the uses and enjoyments of final concern, religious, moral, legal, economic, political. The demand for reform of logic is the demand for a unified theory of inquiry through which the authentic pattern of experimental and operational inquiry of science shall become available for regulation of the habitual methods by which inquiries in the field of common sense are carried on. So the reason why we need to reform logic is, or at least a reason why we ought to reform logic, is it shows us the connection better with common sense and may give us tools for improving our common sense behaviors, our common sense inquiries. And I kind of stopped short, actually, I think, of the final bit of this sentence. So let me go back a moment. Demand for a reform of logic is the demand for a unified theory of inquiry through which the authentic pattern of experimental and operational inquiry of science. So the way that science is done in its best mode of the modern times shall become available for regulation of basically common sense inquiries by which conclusions are reached and beliefs are formed and tested in the common sense world. In the next chapter, the nature of this common pattern forms the theme of discussion. All right, and there we have finally ended this kind of introductory part of Dewey's logic. And we'll now go on to, in the next video, the pattern of inquiry, the common pattern of inquiry that you find across all domains of life, and what that can teach us about how to do logic. Okay, so that's all for now. Thanks for listening.